Hi, my name is Alex Juhasz, and I'm a professor of film at Brooklyn College, the City University of New York. I'm a longtime HIV/AIDS activist and scholar and artist, and I have connected that AIDS activism to a new body of thinking and work, which I think of as COVID activism and long haul COVID activism, art making, community making, and thinking. And that is what I'm going to talk about today in this session, where I introduce you to how to think about multiple perspectives of crisis, multiple perspectives of COVID. In my session, I'm going to tell you my story or one of my crisis stories of COVID. And I'm also going to tell you my story or one of my crisis moments of long COVID. And I'm going to introduce some projects that I've worked on with collectives and with collaborators, where I work with people that I'm already affiliated with politically to multiply or share or reframe or extend my own experience of crisis and of COVID, and try and think about that in relationship to other people's experiences, but also to more systemic social, cultural, political issues, which have always exacerbated and defined the AIDS crisis ongoing, and which in similar ways have framed, organized, and structured COVID. And in my analysis and lived experience of both of these interlock crises, I would have to say that poverty, that is class, and racism, and certainly in this country, the United States, have been definitive as structural forces that have made the experiences of people different and unequal in these two crises. Certainly thinking about gender and sexuality have also been important for me. So when I think about a story to share with you about a crisis that I had with COVID, I'm going to quickly tell you about how I had COVID in March 2020 in New York, which was the epicenter of the crisis. And I had symptoms so early in COVID that there was really no information about it. And also, the city of New York was under so much brutal, catastrophic loss and uncertainty that you couldn't go to see a doctor if you had COVID, but you weren't extremely sick. So when I got COVID in March 2020, my boyfriend also had COVID, and we ended up isolating with each other and helping each other in his apartment in Brooklyn, in New York City. And my two young adult children lived in my apartment away from us to keep them safe. We were in isolation, all of us, but my boyfriend and I more so because we were sick. There was always sirens. There was always helicopters. There were the sounds of people that I knew as a sick person were being rushed to the hospital. I also knew that there wasn't ventilators for them at the hospital. So I had a huge amount of fear that I would get more sick and end up in a hospital hall without being able to be helped by doctors. And this revealed to me a privilege that I have as a professional, middle-aged white woman in Brooklyn, which is that I had never encountered a medical system that couldn't help me if I was ill. And it was a radical and very scary awakening and enlightenment to what the experience of healthcare is for most people in the world. At the time that my children were separated from me, they were very afraid for my health and also having to take care of themselves in a way they never had before. And that was very stressful for me, but it was the healthy thing to do. Where I turned at that time was to the internet, because there was no good information about what COVID was, how long it lasted, what I could expect, how I might help myself or treat myself. And where I found people in March of 2020 was on Facebook. And I began to interact with other people who were explaining that they had COVID and were at home, and that it was lasting longer than people had expected, that they didn't have a fever. I didn't have a fever. I also noticed that one of my closest friends, who was a longtime AIDS activist and organizer like me, Pato Hebert, was posting pictures on Instagram about his own experience with COVID and what he was learning and what he was feeling. And he was documenting that. And he and I began to interact virtually, supporting each other when we were both pretty sick. And neither of us were getting much care from the medical establishment. At that time, I was also beginning to communicate with activists who I had known in the real world, with a group that I'm involved with called What Would an HIV Doula Do? And that is a collective of activists, artists, thinkers who come together to engage with what HIV means now and how we can help people and our communities given the ongoing weight, violence, but also possibilities that HIV produces in the lives of people and communities. So the first example I want to give about sharing crisis is that, like lots of people, the doulas began to meet online and just talk to each other and think about what it was like to live in COVID in isolation, especially at the beginning when people were really uncertain about how to live isolated online, and people were really lonely and people were really scared. And so initially the doulas, a group that was already thinking about HIV, became a support group for each other. And I know a lot of people did that online. What perhaps may be different is that because we were already committed to an analysis about HIV, which primarily thought about bettering the lived experience for individuals who have HIV and the communities that are impacted by HIV, which are primarily poor people and people of color in the United States and across the global South, we were not just supporting each other, but we were thinking about COVID with an analysis we already knew from HIV. And what we wanted to do was learn from each other. And what we wanted to do was think together. And what we wanted to do was share those ideas with other people. And so quickly, and then across the pandemic, What Would an HIV Doula Do? Produced 3 zines that were built from short pieces of writing that anyone in the group could share if they were so inclined. And I want to emphasize that one of the things that's really powerful about this collective is that we are diverse, but not in the way that maybe Americans quite simply think about that, which is diverse racially, but we are particularly interestingly diverse intergenerationally, which is hard specifically in queer contexts where so many people of my generation, and I'm 58 years old, died of AIDS. But we're also diverse in relationship to our serostatus. That is to say, we're an HIV group where some people have HIV and others do not. And yet we have all devoted time to think about doulaing people with HIV. And so in these 3 zines, which are called What Does a COVID-19 Doula Do? In Our Bodies, a zine about pleasure, intimacy, and reality in 2020, and what does an uprising doula do, I think we model some of what I want you to think about in relationship, or all of us to think about together, in what it means to have multiple perspectives of a crisis. And for these three zines, what we did was that we worked quickly. We honored the fact that everyone had a different focus. We were engaged in a doing together so that we didn't stop with talking and feeling. We then made something and then we shared it. And so this process of learning from each other, understanding that our voices matter, and that in the complexity of our lived and shared experience made into art, made into something to share, a larger picture of COVID and our political critique of COVID and our hopes for making life better for ourselves and people we cared for was produced. The second story I want to tell you about is about long hauling. So I did get better from COVID. It was slow, it was painful and scary. But a few months later, I began to have strange symptoms that weren't particularly serious, but were not related to how I had lived in my body before COVID. And there was a large clustering of symptoms kind of all at the same time. So I began to be covered with hives. My body responded differently to bug bites. As I told you, I'm 58 years old. And oddly, I got my menstrual cycle again, which is can be a sign of cancer. My sleep was disrupted. My heartbeat was elevated. It affected my moods. And all of this was happening, again, so early that no one really knew what long COVID was. And doctors certainly did not. And again, I learned mostly about what was happening to me, what I could do about it, and where I might want to go from people online. Because very quickly, a community of people with long COVID began to organize using what we had learned from patient-led research and patient-led advocacy from HIV. And so online, I was reading the work of several of these organizations of patients that were informing each other, demanding help, helping doctors understand what was happening to us, and signaling that nobody was paying attention to long-haul COVID. But as importantly, I was having those conversations with my friend Pato Hebert, with whom I had first suffered COVID. And Pato and I ended up long hauling together over the course of a year and a half. And as was true of our doula work, and Pato is also in the doula collective, we started to also engage as artists and critics and thinkers and people with a political analysis publicly. So over the time of our long hauling, Pato, as I told you, had been taking photographs of his ongoing experiences as someone who was quite sick with COVID and then also quite sick as a long hauler. And we began to write and publish about our shared experiences and also our analysis of the ways in which COVID follows and is impacted by gross inequities in our culture in the United States and actually globally. So why some people suffer more than others, why people of color and poor people in particular have different health outcomes to do with access to education, medicine, a sense of safety in their own communities, and so on. So the project that we did together, which again, I think reflects what it means to have multiple perspectives on the crisis, is that even though we started out as the two of us, and the two of us published several pieces of writing over the extensive period of our long hauling, we ended up also organizing a series of writing on the internet called Long Hauling, which was a series of essays highlighting the stories of long COVID from survivors, as well as community efforts to use these lessons from COVID, but also other viruses and other endemic injustice, whether biological or cultural, to think about how to live and love and thrive in the uncertainties of these late pandemic years. And in our series, Long Hauling, what we began to do is to extend the analysis of what it means to stay persistently or consistently sick, to not get better, to have symptoms that crescendo, that come and go, that doctors don't understand, that people don't take seriously. How thinking about long hauling was a way to think about life and other conditions in late stage capitalism and the other kinds of assaults to our environment, to our communities, to our families that are endemic in this stage of human history. And so we invited other analyses to join the body of writing that we had already produced, including pieces about time, memory, and indigenous histories and legacies, the extraordinarily timeless experience and placeless experience of pain, something that all human beings can understand as a durational experience that both attacks but also proves our humanity, what it means to think about harm reduction in relationship to drug use, particularly in communities of color in New York, how disability is part of a larger problem in our culture, at least in the United States, of how to care for somebody who may not be as well as others, or may actually just be differently experiencing their body than others, and that doesn't ever end with getting better, but it ends with being ideally supported and understood and cared for on your own terms, and thinking about how our lives online technologically, through the idea of Zoom fatigue, were extending and exacerbating and adding to our dehumanization, our isolation, our sense of uncertainty and fear, even as these corporations that produce technological tools have consistently told us that what these tools do is extend us into the world and make us feel better. And so I offer to you our series, Long Hauling, as another example of how to extend one's own lived experience of a crisis, how it feels in your own body, how it feels in your own home, how it feels in your family or your community, to add that and refract that and complicate it and nuance it and build from it with the voices of others who are in your movement or your political perspective, but may also be outside of that, and to try and begin to find those connections, because that is how we will find power as the people who are on a daily basis affected by the structures and inhuman and punitive ways of being that were in place long before this crisis, and that we hope will become more apparent because of it. So I hope that you take some solace from the amazing words of wisdom of my peers, the art that they have made, but as much so from our drive to make that visible and to share it and to learn from it as one of the first and most important steps of using stories, but understanding that our own story is only as valuable as it is when we connect it in ways that are complex, human, loving, and open-hearted to the experiences and stories of other people. So thank you so much. And our next session will be a exercise for you to do to try and extend your story to align and connect to the stories of others.
Thanks so much, Alex, for sharing that. I think what I really enjoyed was that although I've heard you speak about your work and projects in different spaces, in this space, it was still a little bit different. And I heard even more layers to your work and the nuances in terms of what connects your projects and the intention behind it. So thank you so much for sharing. It was really inspiring.
Of course.